Before we start, I'll just make one correction. It's actually AgResearch New Zealand, so that's fine because I'm an Australian, so I can take it both ways, so it's not really a problem. I'm going to be talking a little bit today about New Zealand's experiences in the policy space around water. It's going to be a little bit in the freshwater, surface water space rather than the groundwater space, but what I'm going to be talking about is something that I think is going to affect a number of different systems in a number of different countries in a few years to come. So we'll just get started. So New Zealand has about 425,000 kilometres of rivers and streams and about 4,000 lakes and aquifers, and most of those are connected in some way, shape or form. And that is just something to remember. It's a really interconnected system where we've got a lot of groundwater, we have a lot of surface water, and we have a lot of lakes. And almost all of those are in some way, shape or form affected by agriculture, which is a really important sector in New Zealand. So about 15% of GDP comes from agriculture, including the downstream processing. It makes up a very large portion of our export value. And we've had this thing that's been sitting over our heads for a little while called, which is the government's goal to double the value of primary industry exports by 2025. And even though it's value, meaning the actually monetary value, that has also come along with a fairly large increase in production. And a lot of that production has come through the intensification of pastoral farming, predominantly dairy cows. And unlike our last speaker, JP, who was saying that manure was a really big problem here in California, actually in New Zealand it's urine. And that's because we've got a pasture-based system, and us ladies apparently when we have to go to the bathroom have to stand, and we have very concentrated urine patches, while boys, they just walk around. And so that has been really the biggest contribution to our problem around nitrogen. So just to put this in a little bit of context, you know, as we've been having this large intensification of dairy, the government has also realised that there's been increasing conflict around how we've managed our water. And about 2009 they started the freshwater reforms, which was really trying to change the way that we managed our freshwater systems. And so they came up with something called the National Policy Statement for Freshwater Management. And it has a couple of objectives that are worth knowing and then a few policies. But essentially in the water quality space, they really had some objectives around sustainably managing the use and the development of land, and most importantly, the discharge of contaminants. They also had another objective, which was saying that you had to improve the quality of fresh water in bodies that had been already degraded by human activities to the point of being over-allocated. So very much about we've got to make some changes in the way we manage our water. And that's to be achieved through a couple of different policies. One of the key ones that's being rolled out at the moment is to establish freshwater objectives and set freshwater limits. So this is really saying what is our vision for freshwater, and then what is the load limit or the discharges that we're going to allow to actually meet those objectives. And then of course we're going to specify those targets, and then we're going to have implementation methods put in place. And these are both a mix of both regulatory and non-regulatory. And that's kind of the sort of the situation that we've been in New Zealand, where there's been fairly fast-moving in changes in how we've been managing our freshwater resources. Now, tied to that has also been our policy development process. And if you look on the left-hand side, your left-hand side, you'll see what is the existing methods, and that's the fairly typical one. So this is where policymakers go away, they can consult with some people, they draft a plan, and it goes through these hearings and appeals and court processes. And that's sort of where a lot of our conflict has gone. Now, since about 2000, we've had the rollout of something a little bit different. And most of that change in the policy statements or the policy process is in the top end. And so what they've done is said, right, to try and avoid some of this conflict, we're going to create these collaborative processes where we're taking people from the communities and we're going to sit you down for sometimes very long periods of time, like years, to come up with what are our loads, how we're going to manage, what are going to be the policies in place. And this was all in the pretext that this would actually lead to a less contentious policy development approach for fresh water. And we've got about half the regions in New Zealand are actually rolling out these processes as we speak. So for the rest of the talk, I'm going to be talking a little bit about some of the challenges and then going into depth with one of the key challenges that I see where I think New Zealand's the first to actually really hit it in a big way. So some of the key challenges these collaborative process groups are coming up against, and arguably they're probably the same as any other policymaker, but all of a sudden we've got communities dealing with these, is firstly is around co-governance. This is probably very much in a New Zealand context, but maybe Canada, the US, the Indian population as well in the US and other nations where there's a large Indigenous population, this might be an issue. And this is where, through some of our treaty laws in the past, there's been the ability or the desire of our Indigenous peoples to co-manage the natural resources. So we're working through a process about how in the heck we actually manage freshwater jointly from a government perspective, but also the tribes in the region. The next one is probably one of the contentious ones, is setting that limit. Is what is going to be the load that's allowed to come off the land and off individual farms? And of course there's certain sectors in New Zealand, and the agricultural sector in particular, that doesn't want any skin left in the table. In other words, they really want to push the system as much as they can. So that's causing some challenges. And then tied to that, of course, is who bears the cost. Now, what's really interesting when you start thinking about setting that limit, you can have a limit at a watershed level, but then you've got to think, well, how do I actually develop the policy? And there's typically two ways you can do this. One is the practice-based policy that we see in many parts of the world, and quite quickly we're finding in a number of watersheds around the country that there's not enough good management practices to actually reduce the nutrient leaching to the point that we need it to be. So that's one of the challenges that have come up. Now, if they've gone down the other route, which is a performance-based policy, then we come up with a different set of challenges. And a performance-based policy is where you might take that overall cap and then allocate it or divvy it up between individual farmers, and they're given an individual load limit. And that, of course, is where the million-dollar question of actually how do you allocate those limits. And I think I'm going to spend the rest of the talk talking about this, and this is a really, really hard stuff. And I didn't actually realise how difficult it was until we started working through some of these sorts of challenges. And even though the US, for example, typically only regulates point sources, it's actually hit the US in terms of point sources before as well. I used to work in Pennsylvania, and certainly the whole conversations around setting up a water quality trading program in Pennsylvania, a lot of the contention related to how you set that initial load limit for the point sources. So even though I'm going to be talking about a non-point sources situation, it's probably hardest there, it certainly also holds in a point source situation as well. So why is allocation important? Well, first of all, you're trying to set that watershed cap. That's been done, but it's a divvying up of that cap between the different land uses. And the question is, how do we make these decisions? And what's really quite interesting is, in its wisdom, a lot of people, including government in New Zealand, firmly believe that there can be one allocation approach. And so there's been a lot of effort striving to find that one allocation approach of how you actually divvy that up between different landowners. And of course, it's not quite as simple as that. And me being an economist and working in policy, most policymakers usually think about how you might do things based on two things. One is efficiency. How much is it going to cost? In other words, we want the lowest cost. And the last is the distribution of costs. In other words, what's the equity related to the different allocation approaches? And this is where a lot of the discussions certainly are at the moment. So I'm going to run you through some results now, or some analysis, just to show you why this is such a difficult thing to do. So I'm going to be looking at a case study. This is in the South Island of New Zealand. There's two catchments, the Hinds and the Selwyn-Waiora. I'm going to run you through three different watershed or catchment policy targets: 10% reduction, 25% and 50% reduction in nitrogen leaching. And they're actually all realistic. In some of those catchments we've got those kind of targets being looked at. And we're going to use an agricultural model to do that, and that model can actually look at assessing different allocation impacts on net revenue from farms, nitrogen leaching and land use. And so this is just a graphic of the model. You've got all your land management and all the different enterprises you might have in a catchment. You've got agricultural output, which is where your farm revenue come from, and there's your environmental outputs. So we're using a modelling approach like this to start looking at these questions around efficiency and also equity. So just a little bit in terms of the allocation approaches, because this is where it becomes quite interesting, and most people around the world aren't talking about allocation quite like this. So we've got 6 different allocation approaches that are being typically talked about at the moment. The first one is grandparenting, and that's just based on discharges based on existing use. We have natural capital, which is where you actually think about the characteristics of the land itself. We've got nutrient vulnerability, which is where you're thinking about how leaky the different soils are. Watershed averaging, which is where you just take the total load and you divide it by the area. Land cover averaging, which is where you start thinking about the different land covers that you might have. So you might have pasture, you might have forest, you might have arable, and then you average them between the different land covers. And then you've got sector averaging, which might be sheep and beef, dairy, forest, agriculture, lifestyle, and then you divide those up equally. And then lastly, you've got a trading program that might be put on top. And of course, trading is just to provide some flexibility for a regulation. And so trading can be applied to actually any of the allocation approaches. So just taking a little bit of an illustrative example of why this is so hard. Here's 4 different farms down the bottom, and then this is the amount of nitrogen they can actually leach. And so if I'm the arable farmer at the end, I'd actually like nutrient vulnerability, because that's going to give me my highest loading. If I look at dairy farmer A, I'm going to actually like grandparenting because it gives me the most. But if I go to dairy farmer B, he'll actually want sector averaging. So all of a sudden you're starting to see that between sectors there's different preferences, but also within a sector there can be different preferences as well. So just having a quick look at these 2 catchments, if you look at them, they're quite close together, but they've got quite a different land use pattern, and they also have quite a different pattern in terms of where the revenue comes from. And so just having a quick look at the results, and this is sort of thinking about efficiency here. So what is the lowest cost allocation method? And so when you start looking at from 1 to 8, 1 is actually the least cost and 8 is the most costly. And just taking a quick look at, say, natural capital, and you look over in the Selwyn, you'll find that at 10 and 25%, natural capital is actually the most, or close to the most expensive approach to use, while actually at 50% it's sort of in the middle. Then if you head across to the hind side of things, at 50%, after sort of the trading, it is actually the least cost. And then it's middling for the other 2. Similarly, if you go to the sector averaging, if you look on the Selwyn side, on the right-hand side, it's actually the least cost after trading. So it's, across the board, doesn't matter what the stringency is. And then while on the left-hand side in the hinds, it's actually sort of middling. So again, even in terms of efficiency, there's not a clear message coming through. Similarly, you start looking at the equity, and this is probably the hard part. This is a distribution of costs. And while this is not going to tell you what the most equitable approach to use, it'll start to give you a bit of an idea of what those distribution of costs are. And so what you're really looking at here is sort of the colours and the widths of the bars. And so if you're looking up here in terms of the 25% here, you'll see that dairy bears a larger burden in the cost under nutrient vulnerability than they do, for example, under sector averaging. And so what you see is you've got variation again between the allocation approaches, and then between catchments you get quite a bit of, there's quite a difference as well. So again, the distribution of costs between each of those allocation options is also different. And so this is a real challenge that policymakers and collaborative processes have to deal with. And for some reason people go in blindly thinking there's going to be a really simple answer to this, and there's not. And so sort of what we're finding, and this is what we thought beforehand, but we've now got some information to verify this, is that when you start thinking about the most efficient allocation approaches to actually use for non-point sources, it varies based on watershed characteristics, land use configuration, and stringency of the policy target. And at least we've got something like economics that can help us actually determine what is the least cost in each of the individual catchments, but it still has to be an exercise that's gone through. But the really tricky question is how to distribute the costs, and that's the real equity challenge, because there is no right or wrong answer. It really is very much a political decision. And what we actually see is that because this is the part that really hurts farmers the most, that's what they jump to. And as a result, you have people seeing results and jumping to this contention very, very early, rather than a process stopping and saying, right, let's think about how we're going to set the principles or make those decisions around equity before we see any results, before we understand what those distribution of costs are. Because unless you do that, then we're going to be really stuck in this very sort of antagonistic, contentious sort of situation where people, even within the same sector, are wanting different outcomes. And so our message to everyone when they're starting to think about this is really, really think about how you're going to make these allocation decisions or what you're going to base them on very early, so that you understand what the principles of equity are and sort of where and how you might think about efficiency. And so even though New Zealand is hitting this probably earlier than other places, I firmly believe we're going to see challenges like this come through more and more. And we're going to see it in surface water, we're going to see it in groundwater as well. And I'll just leave it at that.
Suzie, thank you for coming all the way out here. One question on this is, and in California we're struggling with many of these same questions, as you know. This approach of sharing the burden of cutting down and maybe trading or stuff, or moving back and forth and figuring out ways how to distribute that works when you have a resource that's really well mixed, like surface water. But when you have groundwater, which is not well mixed, and you're talking about receptors that are distributed within that basin in form of domestic wells or public supply wells that you're trying to protect. Can you do this, or what do you do? Because you can't cut one, or you can't kind of allocate or trade caps because you're trying to protect a particular well that's being impacted by one particular group of polluters.
Yeah, so that's going to the trading side of that rather than the allocation side. So in trading, you've got the same sort of situations in freshwater systems as in surface water as well, where you might have hotspots that you're trying to avoid. And so you have things like can't trade upstream and downstream, for example. And depending on your groundwater system, you might have some situations like that where you know what the flows of the groundwater system are from one part to another. So you could think about something like that. But in terms of this allocation, which is on the regulation side, how much can you actually let go into the system? I think that still holds with a groundwater system, because what you're trying to do is reduce the amount of nitrogen or nitrate that's actually making it into the groundwater, and how do you actually divvy that up equally across, or not equally, but within a system. So I think there's two parts to that. Yes, the allocation stuff I think holds perfectly well with what goes in, but in terms of trading, yes, it would be the kind of aquifer and how that aquifer moves around, whether you could actually trade your allocation.
Other questions?
Thank you very much for a very interesting presentation. I had a question related to, I think, your first slide on the contradiction between what the Ministry of Primary Industry wants, doubling the value of agriculture, and what you talked about at the end, which is the world's presentation on reducing, efficient nitrate, or nutrient pollution. So what can you say about that? Is there a problem when they are going into implementation of those allocation regimes, or do they just forget about the goal of doubling value, or is it embedded into the discussion?
No, it's what you call growth within limits. It's a real quandary, and I think we have a policy environment that's grown up a lot in the last couple of years, and we've also got a farming environment that's suddenly realising the misalignment between policies. I was actually at one of the collaborative process meetings not too long ago, and I had a farmer sit up and go, just come back from Wellington, which is our capital city, and you know what they're telling us? We've got this irrigation acceleration fund, but we're trying to set limits. And so you do have this real problem. And so I think what they're trying to do is try to claw back or to reduce where you've got over allocation, and then trying to hold the ground on those that aren't currently over allocated. And if you're in that situation, then by all means irrigate, by all means grow. So it's a $1 million quandary.